Welcome to the Prophecy Club, where we study and research Bible prophecy. Our topic tonight is emerging viruses, AIDS, and Ebola. We know that Revelation talks about a time when a fourth of the world's population will be killed by plagues, by beasts, by famine. So we know that plagues is part of it. And we don't know exactly how it all fits together. But we do see for the first time in all of mankind's existence, there now exists the possibility to eliminate the human race by viruses, AIDS, and Ebola. Now, Jesus speaking Matthew 24 said that a time would come that unless He returned, no flesh would be saved. So we know, truly, that we are getting very close to the end. Our speaker tonight is well qualified to speak on the subject. He is the investigator that researched and investigated and exposed the dental AIDS tragedy, the dentist that was infecting his patients with AIDS. And as a result of that, exposing that truth, God has now called him to expose other truths. He's since written 80 articles, 10 books, his most recent of which is Emerging Viruses, AIDS, and Ebola. Will you help me welcome Lynn Horowitz?
Thank you very much. Good evening. How are you all doing tonight? Good. Excellent. I hope you'll be doing that well when we're done tonight. Unfortunately, it's a very solemn and very disturbing presentation that I have to give you, but I want to tell you that the context of tonight, if you hold it in the context in which Revelation is written and talks very clearly about how the Lord is setting up the powers that be to really finally fall, so that despite the horror and the very unfortunate facts that I'm going to be sharing with you tonight, please hold all of this in a greater context. Know that who we are as human beings, God created as a magnificent being composed body, mind, emotions, imagination, intuition, and our will hopefully is connected to God's will, and that through the balance of who we are and our love for God and our spiritual devotion, and through God's grace, we are empowered to develop our immune systems despite all the horror that I'm going to be sharing with you tonight. The take-home message is to be aware. I'm going to offer you tonight a flashlight that's going to help you and your families, guide you through the very dark hours of darkness that it will befall pretty much all of us pretty soon. The writing is on the wall. But in general, please feel that this is not a horrible thing that we should necessarily look so dreadfully at, that it is an opportunity. That when we turn all crisis into opportunities, when we see the glass is half full versus half empty, and that is truly what God wants for us, I believe. So, at any rate, I want to just let you know how I began. Stan mentioned it a little bit. How I began investigating the origin of the AIDS and Ebola viruses. I spent the last 3 years full-time doing that. And what got me started was that case in Florida. Many of you remember the case of the Florida dentist who infected his patients with the AIDS virus. You remember what a terrible mystery that was. Well, the government covered up the evidence in the case, and that's why it was a mystery. There's no mystery when you put all the pieces of the puzzle together. At the time in 1989, when that case broke, 1990 it broke, I was the chief professional advisor for the world's largest dental and medical catalog supply company. And at the time, you remember how afraid everyone was of going to their dental offices, and still probably many of you are still afraid. Well, I was assigned to develop patient educational literature that day to help allay people's fear of going into dental and medical offices. And I simply began, like you would probably begin an assignment like that. Having had a master's in public health degree from Harvard in behavioral science and a dental degree, I practiced dentistry for 16 years, and I got another master's degree in health education and healthy human development. I did a lot of research, and I had the expertise to go into the library and dig up the Centers for Disease Control official investigation reports. I found them to be scientifically bogus, and then about a year later I found that they were fraudulent. The authorities had literally deleted, covered up the critical evidence that they needed to solve the mystery of the case. And what I found after going to the FBI and using the FBI's official methods and materials and investigating these types of unsolvable mysteries, these serial killings. I found that the dentist, Dr. Acker, had, in essence, done what every organized serial killers love to do. They all kill, says the FBI, for the sake of power, control, and revenge. And so the number one deadly innocence, that was the name of the investigation I called it, the number one deadly innocence investigation question became, against whom did he hold a vendetta? And it became very, very clear there was legal testimony to the effect that his principal vendetta was against the United States Public Health Service and the Centers for Disease Control and the World Health Organization, who he believed had created and purposely deployed the AIDS virus, the virus from which he was dying. In essence, he did what all organized serial killers love to do. You know how, like, the mail bomber plays games with the authorities, publishes his manifesto and, manipulates? Well, that's what they do, and that's exactly what Dr. Acker did. In essence, he created a crime, a mystery that couldn't be solved without implicating the government. If they told the truth in the case, the whole world would want to know motive. And the motive was screaming loud and clear in the legal testimonies. It was that he believed in what was called the World Health Organization theory of AIDS. It was promoted in 1986 by Dr. Robert Strecker, an MD, PhD, who was asked by a very large insurance company to develop actuarial tables to alert the insurance companies as to what they would be spending for AIDS patient care. And so Dr. Strecker started researching AIDS, and he and his brother, who was an attorney, began to get some information which led Dr. Strecker to believe that the AIDS virus was man-made, and that his brother, an attorney, had obtained through the Freedom of Information Act a very interesting document. Excuse me. There's this thing that happens. Dentists know quite a bit about it. When you're a speaker, if you don't get nervous, you're not a very good speaker, I'm told. And what happens when you get nervous, stress, peripheral vasoconstriction, and there's this thing called xerostomia, dry mouth, that comes. So Dr. Strecker had produced a 2-hour videotape called the Strecker Memorandum, which laid out his thesis. And his brother, Ted, had obtained through the Freedom of Information Act a horrifying document. A Department of Defense appropriations request for 1970 funding for $10 million for the development of immune system ravaging viruses for germ warfare. In fact, if you read that document carefully, it says that the National Academy of Sciences National Research Council informed the Department of Defense around 1968-69 that for $2 million a year for 5 years they could develop a new infective microorganism which could, quote, differ in certain important aspects from any known disease-causing microorganisms, and most importantly, it could be refractory to the immunological and therapeutic processes upon which we depend to maintain our relative freedom from infectious diseases, end quote. In other words, to create a germ that you could not treat and that it would knock out the host immune system. In essence, if your assignment was to write a definition of the AIDS virus in 1969, you would be hard-pressed to write it any better. So with that document staring me in the face, I was horrified. Once I had finished the deadly innocence investigation, I looked at that document and I said, no, this couldn't be, because I, like most of you, could never imagine this could be true. I thought this guy has got to be a fraud in the Strecker, although I hadn't seen the Strecker Memorandum yet. This guy Strecker, I thought, has to be crazy. But, curiosity got the better of me, and I started to investigate. I went back into Harvard's Countway Medical Library, and just for the sake of satisfying my curiosity, I began to pull out the World Health Organization Chronicles, because this was called the World Health Organization Theory. So I went back, and I figured, okay, 1970 funding, go back 5 years from there, and go forward 5 years from there. So between 65 and 75 was my study period. And I pulled the World Health Organization Chronicle, and I began to read them, and I learned some very interesting things that somebody you would think with a master's in public health from Harvard, with having professional school training, involved in dental public health, that I would have learned something about the World Health Organization. Well, no, I really didn't learn a lot about it. But what I learned from reading this, I learned that these were pretty much the godfather to the pharmaceutical industry. in essence, anything that the pharmaceutical companies needed to use to develop new drugs, the reagents, all of the standards were being set by the World Health Organization. And that they would even determine what drugs would remain legal, which ones would be illegal. And I learned that during the 1960s, they were developing what was called the Viral Research Network. And by 1970, they proudly published that they had isolated, quote, isolated, well over 70,000 viruses. Come to find out a little while later, most of those viruses that they isolated were actually viral recombinants, genetic mutants. Hybrids, what they called hybrids, genetic recombinants. And that by 1970, they had distributed these to well over 500 different research laboratories throughout the world. And I learned that they had used 4 principal agencies to distribute these. And the 2 major distributors of the viruses they published were the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta and the National Cancer Institute in Bethesda. Well, I don't know how many of you have read the book, The Band Played On by Randy Schultz, or watched the HBO special based on the book, wherein Dr. Robert Gallo is played by Alan Alda. And you might recall Dr. Gallo got involved in what's called the French-American AIDS fracas. Dr. Gallo is the guy who allegedly discovered the AIDS virus in 1984. And come to find out, he actually cloned Luc Montagnier's virus and then took credit for the discovery. And then France began to sue the United States, and that litigation only ended about a year and a half ago. And about a year ago, President Clinton pardoned Robert Gallo for scientific fraud and misconduct. Now, when does the President of the United States ever pardon a scientist? It's a little bizarre, isn't it? So, anyway, Dr. Gallo is notorious. He's hated by some, he's loved by some. But as I read that the National Cancer Institute was one of the principal viral distributors for the World Health Organization, it occurred to me that the world's preeminent retrovirologist, Dr. Robert Gallo, who hails from the National Cancer Institute, might be the subject of an inquiry. So I did, again, probably what you would do. I went into Harvard's Countway Medical Library. I pulled Index Medicus. I pulled 40-some-odd papers that had been listed in Index Medicus that Dr. Gallo published between 1967 and 1974. And what I did is buried myself in a room for 3 weeks, came out looking pale, having read every paper 3 times, and in essence came out with 6 pages of notes, study titles, year, study conclusions, and the possible relationship of HIV synthesis. Now, most dentists, of course, don't get a lot of virology training, and I don't claim to be a viral expert. However, we get the basic knowledge, and all it really took was a lot of cross-referencing in medical text to be able to figure out the jargon, because the medical jargon, you can get lost in it. But at any rate, having done that, I found some absolutely incredible things. One of the things that I found out is that between 1962 and 1976, the National Cancer Institute ran what was called the Special Virus Cancer Program, which was a largely funded, highly secret program, predating Nixon's war on cancer. And Dr. Robert Gallo was intimately involved with a group called Litton Bionetics Research Laboratories. Now, many of you might have heard of Litton Industries. They're known to be a major military weapons contractor. And they had a subsidiary called Litton Bionetics Research Labs. And I noticed that Dr. Gallo, maybe 20 to 30% of what he published with co-authors from Litton Bionetics Research Labs. Now, I didn't know all this about the military connections of Litton Bionetics, but here you have, for example, a paper that comes out of Nature, the journal Nature, in 1970. And you see the name Dr. Robert Gallo. And you see Robert Ting and Stringer Yang from Bionetics Research Laboratories. And you see what they're studying here is called RNA-dependent DNA polymerase of human acute leukemic cells. Now, for anyone that knows anything about the AIDS virus, there's a very bizarre enzyme called reverse transcriptase. The reverse transcriptase enzyme literally demands that life operate in reverse. Typically, God created all of us with an incredible blueprint of life called DNA, which all of our cells use to make additional proteins. And typically, in health and life, the way God planned it was that the DNA code is read to produce RNA, messenger RNA and transfer RNA, which interact with the cell's ribosomes, which is the protein manufacturing mechanism of the cell, which causes the production of new cell proteins, cell structures, so that new healthy cells get created, and that's what causes life. With the AIDS virus, with this thing called reverse transcriptase, which is also present in the leukemia virus, HTLV1, this enzyme calls for the production of DNA from RNA. It literally says, goes to the ribosome, tells the ribosome, produce from this single strand of RNA that the virus is going to provide, produce a new strand of DNA. It's called a provirus. And then there's another unique enzyme called an endonuclease in the virus. It has like scissors. It cuts open the DNA, the host DNA, and allows this new DNA strand to be inserted so that now when God's creation, this normal healthy cell, reads this new genetic blueprint for life, it produces more viruses than normal healthy cells. So that's the unique enzyme that Dr. Robert Gallo was studying here in 1970. Now, the problem is this. This is 14 years before this man allegedly discovered the AIDS virus in 1984. This is 9 years before this man allegedly discovered the first leukemia virus, HTLV1. And so when I had the great fortune of being the first investigator in the history of the esteemed International AIDS Conference in Vancouver on July 10th, 1996, and I presented the first paper that said that these viruses are undoubtedly man-made. They're laboratory creations. Some of my colleagues internationally, virologists and epidemiologists, said, so what, Dr. Horowitz? So what? So they're studying RNA-dependent DNA polymerase reverse transcriptase 14 years. That's an enzyme. They were studying it. No problem. Well, I said, well, here's the problem. His co-authors are sixth on the list of major Army biological weapons contractors for that period. See Lytton Bionetics. This is out of the congressional record. Also highlighted, you see New York University Medical Center. I'm going to talk more about them later. And in fact, as you review Dr. Robert Gallo's early work, you see that he received reagents and or worked with at least a half a dozen of the top Army's biological weapons contractors in 1969, 1970, 71. Moreover, I told them, well, when you read the papers and you realize what they did, it's pretty extraordinary. In essence, what they published was taking monkey viruses and a variety of animal viruses that caused cancer in animals. Now, you have to remember, you go back to 1970. When was this? This is predating Nixon's war on cancer. At that time, it had never been proven that a virus caused cancer in humans. It was known for sure they caused them in animals. So what they did is, under research contracts, not only for the Department of Defense, but under research contracts for the National Cancer Institute for humanitarian methods and desires, they had tried to study whether viruses cause cancer in humans. And they wanted to also develop vaccines, if they did, And they wanted to also develop diagnostic tests to help screen patients who have cancer viruses or the early subclinical signs of cancer early. So they took monkey viruses that were humanly benign, could barely hurt monkeys, and they recombined them with virtually every animal cancer virus under the sun. For example, they took feline leukemia virus RNA and chicken leukemia sarcoma virus RNA, and they added that to the mix in some experiments in with monkey viruses, such as SV40, such as woolly monkey viruses and other monkey viruses. And these were also in the presence of monkey viruses that contained that bizarre enzyme called simian foamy retroviruses. And at this point, now this RNA caused immune suppression, wasting, and death. This RNA from the cat, for example, caused a whole laundry list of symptoms virtually identical to what AIDS patients suffer from. And at this point now, this virus could still not infect humans. It needed another major mutation. So, in order to get it to jump species, and now you're going to see why Dr. Robert Gallo's claim in 1983 in Cold Springs Harbor that it was an African green monkey that bit a man or was eaten by a man that some 500 years ago was then carried by Portuguese seamen to Japan, why that is such hogwash, scientifically bogus. Now you're going to see why. Because to get this to jump species, they cultured it in some studies in human white blood cells and in other studies in human fetal tissue cells in culture in order to get it to adapt. In order to get it to develop the proteins, the external membrane characteristics, the GP120-like proteins, to have it be able to attach to the human cells, be carried across the cell membranes, enter the gene of the cell, and then do essentially everything that the AIDS virus does in humans. Now, they not only published that, they published where they presented some of this work. For those in the front, you can see up close, in 1970, this was published in, it was presented in Mol, Belgium in 1970 in front of NATO military scientists at a symposium entitled The Uptake of Informative Molecules by Living Cells. And on the evening of July 10th, when Dr. Robert Gallo gave an open forum presentation in Vancouver at the 11th International Conference on AIDS, and that day I had done a radio interview in Vancouver, and there was a documentary film crew there filming a vaccine documentary, and they informed me that Dr. Gallo was going to be giving a presentation in the public forum. And I said, and they asked me, would you care to join us? We're going to tape, and would you care to ask Dr. Gallo a question regarding his research? So I said I would, and I stood up, questions and answer session, and I said, Dr. Gallo, are you at all concerned that your early research, taking monkey viruses and recombining them with things like feline leukemia virus, RNA, and chicken leukemia sarcoma virus RNA might have given rise to the AIDS virus or its progenitors, which, through contamination of monkeys supplied by your colleagues from Lytton Bionetics Research Laboratories to the vaccine manufacturers at Merck Sharp and Dohme, might have caused the contamination of vaccines simultaneously administered to gay men, Willowbrook State School mentally retarded children on Staten Island, both in New York, and blacks in Central Africa. That was in 1974. Well, Dr. Gallo got very angry. He got very, very angry. In essence, he said that I should go back and get a grade 101 level of biological science training, high school level, and denied that there was any relevance of this work to NATO military scientists, that he said that, oh, yes, I was there, but these meetings, they talk about motherhood and fatherhood and sisterhood and brotherhood, and that clearly I was in the wrong. Well, at the end of that meeting, many of the press people came up to me, and Dr. Robert Gallo left quite hastily, and somebody handed him a flyer on the way out, a flyer that contained information about the book Emerging Viruses. And he happened to see that there was the foreword by W. John Martin, who's one of the world's leading vaccine contamination analysts, who worked as the FDA's Bureau of Biologics Director between 1976 and 1980, in charge of testing human vaccines for contamination, who happened to have rented a room in Dr. Gallo's house for some time and was personal friends with Gallo. And then on the back of the flyer, he noticed that there was a testimonial raving the book by the hero to those Gulf War veterans who are coming down with chronic fatigue, Gulf War syndrome, Dr. Garth Nicholson. And Dr. Garth Nicholson is Dr. Robert Gallo's was Dr. Robert Gallo's counterpart at MD Anderson Cancer Research Center, and the two had been involved together in that special virus cancer program, and both had worked at least with people who worked at Fort Detrick, Maryland, America's and the world's leading biological weapons testing center. So he calls Garth Nicholson. He's personal friends with Garth. He says, Garth, so I'll just paraphrase. I didn't hear this conversation. I just heard it secondhand from Dr. Nicholson. He says, what the heck are you doing giving this fellow who's obviously crazy a testimonial like this? Well, in no uncertain terms, Dr. Nicholson said, Bob, he's not crazy. He's a Harvard graduate, and have you read his book? Gallo said, no. Nicholson said, well, Bob, you better read his book. So here's his number. So on July 30th, in the morning, my phone rings. Pick up the phone. This is Gallo. And he begins to tell me, first of all, he apologizes for saying what he said about me. And he begins to tell me that he's not a bad man, that he's a humanitarian like myself, and that he had only minimal association with Lytton Bionetics Research Laboratories, and that he had only minor connections to people who worked at Fort Detrick, Maryland in biological weapons, and that he raised 5 specific objections to my thesis. When I went to check those objections out in the weeks ahead, they were scientifically bogus. I'll just tell them to you really briefly so that you know, and that the people who are listening at home will understand what the disinformation that is going to be spread if and when this information ever comes out. That these viruses that I just showed you, he says, could never have combined. They did not have the, quote, homology. That is the likeness, the similarities needed to combine. That is absolute hogwash. If you go into this research literature, all of Dr. Gallo's mentors said that they could combine. They combined them, and in fact, Dr. Robert Gallo and his own research teams at Bionex combined them. Secondly, they said that there's not enough similarity between the viruses that I just showed you and HIV-1, the human AIDS virus. It's a bizarre, it seems to have no family tree. It's just a branch sticking off by itself. There's no progenitors that they know. They don't know really what gave rise to it. Well, he says there's not enough of like feline leukemia or chicken sarcoma or these other monkey viruses in HIV-1, so it couldn't have been. Well, unfortunately, that's false and misleading too, because it was shown that when you recombine these things in labs, the amount of the mother viruses that remained in the children was oftentimes 5% or even less, and that would not eliminate the possibility that this occurred. But here's what he said. When I pressed him on it, he says, I will not argue with you. I cannot argue with your general thesis. Then he says, and I could tell you even more plausibly how it could have happened by accident at that time. He emphasized accident. So last week I sent Dr. Robert Gallo a letter refuting, or at least objecting to his objections. And I said, if you can tell me how it could have happened more plausibly at the time, please, because I'm very interested in solving the origin of AIDS mystery. So I await Dr. Gallo's response. At any rate, As I presented this work again, I want you to know that I'm going to call on your common sense right now. As I presented this work to my colleagues at the 11th International Conference on AIDS, to the virologist and the epidemiologist, I was calling on their common sense as well. And I was showing them, for example, one of the thousands of studies that they did at the National Cancer Institute with Lytton Bionetics researchers and Dr. Gallo. Here they're looking for, quote, an alternative approach for the detection of possible human leukemia viruses. Fine, it's noble. It's humanitarian. And I have to assume that at least 99% of the researchers who were involved in this, and giving Dr. Gallo the benefit of the doubt, I have to tell you that there's one thing that gets Dr. Gallo off the hook, is that he published. He left a paper trail. If he had in his wildest imaginations ever really thought or believed that it was either going to get out accidentally or intentionally, he wouldn't have made it so easy for someone like myself. But the motives of his superiors are in question. But here is a study where other humanitarians were looking to detect cancer viruses early in human leukemia. So here's what they do. They take mouse sarcoma virus, a mouse sarcoma virus that causes sarcoma in mice. They combine it with mouse leukemia virus to get a hybrid mutant called a mouse leukemia sarcoma virus, which they inoculate into healthy cats, again, to get it to jump species, which they then use this virus, they inoculate that virus into a cat with leukemia, and success. They were able to identify feline leukemia viruses in this leukemic cat. The next step was they took this virus, cultured it through human embryonic cells in culture, and did the same thing for diagnosis in humans suffering from leukemia. Now, do any of you notice that there's a little risk in that? When I shared this information with my colleagues, the virologists in the world, they shook their head. They said, I can't believe they did this. This is so risky. In fact, many of you probably have cats, right? How many of you have cats? Well, you know, the feline leukemia thing is pretty hot. If you go back into the research literature, there are many of the experts were saying that the feline leukemia virus itself was a man-made virus. And you can see how easy it would have been to create those viruses using this type of technology. Now, this was crude. They didn't have the sophisticated, and this was another of Gallo's objections. He says, we could not have designed HIV-1 as a biological weapon because we did not have the, quote, molecular genetics engineering capacity until 1975, which is the same silly argument that Laurie Garrett, the famed reporter who just won the Pulitzer Prize for her coverage of Ebola Kikwit outbreak and wrote the book The Coming Plagues, she conveniently misses the entire period between 1965 and 1975 where they were conducting this sort of crude genetic engineering research. And she says, they couldn't have. All the people that came before me, Strecker and everyone else, they're lost. They're false. Because they did not have the molecular genetic engineering capabilities until 1975, which is true. You know what? Alexander Graham Bell, however, did not need fiber optics to make his first telephone call. And so the bottom line was that they did this, and if you read the definitive text in the field of biological weapons, published by Oxford University Press, contributed by David Baltimore, who was among the members of the National Academy of Sciences National Research Council that informed the Department of Defense that they could do this research for $2 million a year. They tell you that this was exactly what was being done. So I came up with a theory, and basically you're looking at the theory. Here's my new theory on the iatrogenic theory on the origin of AIDS. This is what I just shared with you previously, taking monkey viruses and going from there through a series of mutations and culturing through human white blood cells to HIV-1 or a progenitor. And this is what has been published in the medical scientific literature. You can see this is a very similar type of process. Researchers have actually gone from SIV, simian immunodeficiency virus, in the African green monkey and the chimpanzee. And for your knowledge, all AIDS experts know that the closest thing to the human AIDS virus is the simian immunodeficiency virus from the chimpanzee. And by the way, all of these SIVs, all the simian immunodeficiency viruses in all the different monkeys, they are most plausibly also man-made laboratory creations, and they were only began to be identified in the 80s. So, but anyway, this is where researchers have gone. They've also gone backwards from HIV-1 to produce monkey viruses. Now, you're all told that the AIDS virus doesn't discriminate, aren't you? Hogwash. The AIDS virus discriminates. It even discriminates in IV drug users and gay men. This is taken from the American Journal of Public Health, 1988. It's just one little piece, but there are lots of other examples I could give you. In the short time that we have, I'm just going to give you a couple. This is lifetime needle sharing experience in HIV antibody seroprevalence. That is, this is the behavior in the blue that causes the percentage of the behavior that allegedly causes the transmission of the AIDS virus. That is needle sharing, where bloody needles, contaminated needles are shared among IV drug users. And that's the risk, we're told. And then in the red, you see that's the HIV positive percentage of these IV drug users who are HIV positive. Now, you see that, for example, in San Antonio, 99% of the IV drug users share their needles, share their works. In other words, they're the dumbest IV drug users in the country. Versus the smartest IV drug users in the country are in New York. But look at the difference. Where you have 2% seroprevalence rate in San Antonio, in New York you have 61%. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to conclude that something bizarre happened in New York. Likewise, Tampa, 72% seroprevalence, 0 seroprevalence rate, and 72% share needles. If you look at AIDS diagnosis by half years, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and New York City, again, you compare San Francisco is in the black, Los Angeles is in the white, and New York City is in the purple. Again, you see it is far and beyond the epidemic's prevalence is in New York. And it should have kind of like leveled off a little bit. Something bizarre happened in New York. Well, what could that be? Well, here you see in black. This is actually from the National Cancer Institute and the International Association for Research in Cancer. Their publication, this is 1974 National Cancer Institute monograph, where they show you a map of what they were doing and where they were doing it. And you see very clearly what they're studying: liver cancer viruses, hepatitis B viruses, they believe to cause liver cancer, in New York and in Central Africa, in fact, northwest Uganda. And the story goes that in 1965, at the New York University Medical Center, the documented biological weapons contractor I showed you, a fellow by the name of Saul Krugman began studying the Australian antigen, hepatitis B virus. They suspected caused cancer in human beings. And Saul Krugman began inoculating Willowbrook State School mentally retarded children with this virus. Many died. The informed consent was not gained at that particular time. The bioethics would never stand today of that work. What they found out was by 1970, they were close to developing a vaccine. So at that point in time, Saul Krugman turned the project over to Maurice Hilleman at Merck Sharp and Dohme. Maurice Hilleman is the world's leading vaccine developer for both the military as well as the pharmaceutical industry. And He worked with Robert Purcell at the National Institute for Allergies and Infectious Diseases, and they worked also with Dr. Baker at the Centers for Disease Control, and they also worked with that wonderful agency called the Food and Drug Administration. And what they did is they had trouble getting enough virus. You know, it was hard to grow viruses, especially in the children. They kept dying. So they tried to culture it in tissue cultures, and it wouldn't grow. They ended up growing it successfully in rhesus monkeys and chimpanzees. And those chimpanzees, as I told you, were supplied by Litton Bionetics. Again, I told you that SIV, simian immunodeficiency virus from the chimpanzee, is the closest thing to the human AIDS. Now remember this. So they grew those hepatitis viruses in the chimps, rhesus monkeys, and both of those animals were completely contaminated with all sorts of viruses. Herpes viruses, Epstein-Barr, simian cytomegaloviruses, all sorts of things. And they then took the live viruses out of the chimps, and they inoculated it to the Willowbrook State School children in Staten Island, the gays in New York City, and the blacks in Central Africa, to develop the 4 different subtypes of the vaccine that was required for the world's population. And then they took out of those people that they inoculated with that virus the serum from which they made the vaccine. Now, that serum that they took obviously was fully contaminated with everything that they inoculated it with, but if you don't think that's bad enough, the fact is that those individuals had, about a decade earlier, received the Salk and Sabin polio vaccines, which were littered with simian virus contaminants. Monkey viruses. That in 1972, the FDA could have shut down the manufacturer of that virus, of the oral polio vaccine, the Sabin's live viral vaccine, because they knew that they were fully contaminated. In fact, to this day, it is still fully contaminated. The oral polio vaccines that you, by law, are required to give your children are still today fully contaminated with monkey viruses. In fact, the FDA to this day turns a blind eye to as many as 100 simian virus contaminants per dose of the oral polio vaccine. And the reason why they don't tell us is because their hands are tied, allegedly, by non-disclosure and proprietary laws placed upon them by the pharmaceutical companies. They're muzzled. Not even health scientists are allowed to know the truth. So the public, you, never get close to the truth. So that's how, in my opinion, based on the evidence, the AIDS virus got out. They used those people and those contaminated serum to produce the first phase 1, phase 2 studies for lots of experimental hepatitis B vaccine containing 200,000 human doses that they used in 1974 simultaneously in New York City and Central Africa. That explains really almost everything. Although you might have a question, well, weren't there AIDS cases before 1968? No, there were not. Despite the disinformation that you have heard, all of the cases prior to 1976 have been refuted in the scientific literature. The problem is it never made it to the front page of the newspapers like the initial finding, which was disinformation. In fact, the world's leading molecular epidemiologist and genetic evolutionist, his name is Gerald Myers at Los Alamos Laboratories, published in Jay Levy's book called The Retroviridae, which is the definitive text in retrovirology. 1995 publication says that the only isolate. The earliest isolate that we have of HIV-1 is a 1976 strain. Nothing earlier has been found. Now, the issue is we have not just had AIDS outbreaks, AIDS virus outbreaks, or Ebola virus outbreaks. In my opinion, we've had almost everything that they were working with probably has broken out. Their science was so sloppy back then, and still is today. Believe it, it still is today. That, for example, here you see they're working in Central Africa and in Bethesda with herpes-type viruses. You know this thing called chronic fatigue? We'll talk about it a little bit later. But that is most plausibly caused by simian cytomegaloviruses, Epstein-Barr viruses, that's the herpes-type viruses, and, of course, Dr. Gallo's new discovery, herpes B virus. That's exactly where they were working with it at that time. And the chronic fatigue syndrome, also an infectious disease, the whole epidemic has followed the AIDS epidemic just about identically. Also, what you see here is they're working on prostate cancer viruses. And they were working on, in other studies that I read, breast cancer viruses. In fact, they took mouse mammary, you can read it in the book, they took mouse mammary tissue cancer viruses, caused breast cancer in mice. And they were fooling around with those, and they mutated them and manipulated them, as I showed you before. And then they started finding them in cattle. And then they started finding them a couple years later in cattle's milk. And then they started finding them in female breast milk, lactate. So you might say that it is possible, and as a scientist I can tell you that it's certainly within reason now, to speculate and suggest, theorize, that between 1902, when the cancer registries began, and 1970, where prostate cancer and breast cancer was flatlined, and all of a sudden in the 70s you had a little increase, and in the 80s you had a larger increase, and in the 90s now you have it's going off the roof. Again, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to conclude, well, maybe we should consider that this is the source of our current cancer epidemics. Again, here is a chart by Gerald Myers that says, he calls his theory the Big Bang. He says in the Big Bang happened in the early 1970s, where all of a sudden SIV from the African green monkey or the chimpanzee all of a sudden spouted roots and grew into the different types of HIV all around the planet by 1975. The theory that I just suggested to you makes total sense, because they developed the different subtypes from those viruses. And of course, in developing the subtypes in different individuals, of course you'd have slightly different strains. Well, in the end of the investigation, I lucked out. In fact, because you are a Christian audience, and most of our viewers will be Christians, I'll share with you the miracle of me finding this. I hesitate on sharing this with most people, particularly non-Christians, because, they look at you like you're crazy. And quite honestly, as a scientist, as a healthcare professional, as somebody who has an important story to tell, I try not to let people know how crazy I am. So, what happened was I was, towards the end of my investigation, I was at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and by God's grace, I wasn't supposed to be there. I had gotten a phone call. I was supposed to be at a seminar. They canceled last minute. They painted the auditorium where it was supposed to be held, and they couldn't find another auditorium. Last minute cancellation. So where was I? I was coming north from Florida. I said to my wife, let's stop into North Carolina at Chapel Hill. They have a great school of public health there, and I can do some library research. So I had a couple outstanding congressional records that I hadn't found yet. So I went to the librarian there, government documents office, And I said, can you help me find these references? And he says, yes, follow me. So I'm walking down following this fellow to the congressional records, and I'm 10 yards behind him. He's going fast. I'm walking fast, and all of a sudden, I hear an extremely strong inner voice. Now, the Christians, you can call it an angel. The rational scientists, you can call it your intuition. And I heard this voice say, stop. And it was so strong, I stopped. It said, turn right. I turned right. It said, walk. I said, okay. So then there's this fellow. Now I got a problem. Here's a librarian I'm supposed to be following. And I'm turning this way. I'm going off in another direction. And he looks at me and goes, where are you going? I said, oh, don't mind me. I'm just going over here. He says, no, there's nothing over there for you. He says, your congressional record's over here. I said, don't mind me. I'll be fine. I'm just going to have a look over here. He says, no, it's over here. And then he starts yelling at me. He says, that's not how you do research. You're not going to find anything. You first get your references and then you look them up. But I was being driven. And I said, don't mind me. He got frustrated. He went and he says, okay, I'll find your congressional records. So I start walking. I hear this voice say, okay, slow. I slow. It says, turn left. I turn left. I'm now walking. It says, walk slow. I'm walking down an aisle of literally 100,000 volumes on both sides of this long, almost football field aisle. I'm walking, and it says, stop. Look down left. I look down left. And there I see the title, Special Virus Cancer Program. I pull it off the shelf, and I yell, I found what I'm looking for, So I look, and what this was the contracts for the program. What you're looking at is the contract under which the AIDS and Ebola viruses, the AIDS-like and Ebola-like viruses were developed. See the name, Dr. Robert Gallo, project officer for the National Cancer Institute? See the name Robert Ting? John Landon was director of Bionetics Research Laboratories, NIH grant number 2025, title Investigation of Viral Carcinogenesis in Primates, in Monkeys. For those in the front, you can look closely. It says, date contract initiated February 12, 1962. Annual funding level, $2.15 million. And that's how come the National Academy of Sciences National Research Council was able to inform the Department of Defense in 1969 that for $2 million a year, for 5 years, they could develop these viruses because they had just done it. They had just done it. So another $10 million of your taxpayer money went to fund the development of the current plague. This was the contract in which spread the virus most plausibly. This is Merck Sharp and Dohm's contract, Merck and Company contract, NIH 71-2059, and an adjacent contract. This one was called Study of Viruses in Human and Animal Neoplasia, that is cancer, and then there was the next one which talked about development of vaccines. All of the contracts are published in the book, Emerging Viruses, AIDS, and Ebola. In fact, what was extraordinary, once I had these documents and I photocopied them, I then thought to myself, I wonder if these documents still exist in the libraries. And lo and behold, I searched. It wasn't at the other libraries, several of the other libraries I checked. And so I went right into Fort Detrick, right to the National Cancer Institute's library. I thought for sure it would have to be here. It was pulled off the library's catalog. And I went back to Harvard, the same thing. Now what I have done is I've published the call numbers for it in Emerging Viruses, AIDS, and Ebola so that librarians throughout the country can protect those documents because they are the most incriminating documents you could never imagine. So then there is the issue of Ebola. How many of you read the book, The Hot Zone? Lots of you. Very nice. Of course, it's about 2.5 years, there were millions of copies sold. It was the #1 New York Times nonfiction book. Best-selling nonfiction work on the New York Times bestseller list for over 2.5 years. The Hot Zone by Richard Preston. The thesis was that as man infringes upon the tropical rainforest, as we cut down the rainforest, these viruses are under lumber and grass, and they are jumping out and entering into us. Well, Richard Preston, and also there was a place called Kidham Cave. Kidham Cave, that's where the book starts. It was a couple hundred miles from northwest Uganda, this very dark cave, in the darkest of Central Africa, where there's black people and they're dark there and they get disease. There's nothing like racist literature for you. And that there was this cave there, Kidham Cave, where this sugar plant factory pumping station operator was taking a hike one day and ran into some bat guano at the bottom of Kidham Cave where the Ebola virus was mutating, and it jumped out and entered this bellow, and he came out with it and then spread it. And this was a terrifying true story that Random House, that glorious publisher in New York City, published as nonfiction. Well, if you go into the scientific literature, not only did Richard Preston change the names, but the character never existed. In fact, the scientific literature tells you that it was 2 women working in a textile mill that was the first people that developed the Ebola. Not this fellow. And more incredibly, Kidham Cave is a metaphor for Lytton Bionetics Research Laboratories. In fact, Preston went on to talk about how the Reston virus, right outside of D.C., you remember this company by the name of Hazleton Research Labs that Preston said supplied monkeys to USMRAD, United States Army Research and Infectious Disease Institute. And that he never said a word that Hazleton was supplying the military with viruses, but that's what they were also doing. In fact, I published their contracts. You can see that they were doing the same exact work that Gallo was doing on monkeys. They were doing it in dogs. And Preston said that they got their Reston virus outbreak monkeys from the Philippines, and they may have. But you know what? When you trace down where the Philippine African green monkeys came from, was Central Africa, was northwest Uganda. And when you look at all the other monkeys, and in fact, here's their document. This is Cold Springs Harbor document that shows Hazleton imported their monkeys. Davis Lab, which has on the West Coast, California, which had several of the Ebola-like virus outbreaks, along with a couple in Philadelphia, they imported their monkeys, and these are the specific genus and species that the monkey outbreak occurred in. And only LBI, Lytton Bionetics Research Labs, had colony-born monkeys. Their colonies were in northwest Uganda, and then they also developed some over here. They worked intimately with the International Association for Research in Cancer, and they had set up their labs, and they used the colonies over there. Preston's thesis is that they used unreliable monkey traders. Unreliable monkey traders. They gave them contaminated monkeys. That's what caused it. Now think about it. You're a National Cancer Institute. These monkeys are expensive. The chimps go for thousands of dollars each, and they use hundreds, if not thousands, of these a year. And the other monkeys all go for $300 to $500 a piece. Now let's say you're in business, the National Cancer Institute. Are you going to rely, first of all, on unreliable monkey traders to supply your monkeys? Or are you going to set up shop? You set up shop. And interestingly enough, as I researched, all of the prize-winning discoveries that the National Cancer Institute made at taxpayer expense, after they discovered it and patented it, they spun it off to for-profit entities, leaving the taxpayer out. I think that is disgusting. At any rate, they set up shop, and they made their own. So Richard Preston's thesis is bogus. In fact, Richard Preston was paid $20,000 by the Sloan Foundation to produce that piece of garbage. That total disinformation that was meant to scare you and let you know that these viruses are coming. Now, who's the Sloan Foundation? Well, they just happen to be very well connected with the Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation. And that they just happen to donate $200,000 a year to MIT under the neurosciences umbrella. How noble. For, quote, public management, mass persuasion technologies research. That is brainwashing. Disinformation. Is it any wonder that Richard Preston would publish this book and Random House would print it? And who else was with Sloan? Well, interestingly enough, on the board of directors was Lawrence Rockefeller. And what they were funding also was heavily the population control councils and population control. And Lawrence Rockefeller also sat, not only on the board, but was the director and president of the Sloan Cancer Kettering Memorial Research Center, which was literally intimately involved in the development of these types of cancers. In fact, they supplied Dr. Gallo with some of his reagents for his research. And that, moreover, Lawrence Rockefeller put together the New York City Blood Council, which was the council of doctors that started the New York City Blood Bank, which was the International Blood Bankers, which if you saw 60 Minutes a few weeks ago, they had a segment, how nice, saying that, quote, the government knew that the blood was tainted, that allowed the 10,000 hemophiliacs in the United States to get tainted blood, as well as tainted factor, blood clotting factor 8, and that it was the government who knew this, and countless others throughout the world who received similar materials. And they didn't do anything. See, but the government's an easy scapegoat, isn't it? It's a nameless being, a nameless bureaucracy. There are people in the government that make these decisions. In fact, those decisions were made by the New York City Blood Council, Blood Bank, Lawrence Rockefeller, et al. So that, in essence, is a summary report on emerging viruses, AIDS, and Ebola. And the horrifying reality is that it was Henry Kissinger in 1968 that ordered the development of these types of viruses. And the story goes like this, and I should touch upon the center third of the book, which goes over the social-political background. In 1968, Kissinger became NSC advisor under Richard Nixon. How he got to that position through history books will tell you that Nelson Rockefeller made Henry Kissinger the Nuclear Weapons Study Group director of the Council on Foreign Relations. That's how he became the nuclear weapons guru. And that, you remember back in those days, I can remember when I was a child, all of the nuclear weapons kind of like alarms where we had to go into fallout shelters. Well, quote, a fallout shelter in every home in America was America's price, the price Americans needed to pay for freedom, said Henry Kissinger. So he became Nuclear Weapons Study Group Director, became the man who was behind the deployment of strategic nuclear missiles in Europe, and in 1968, he was looking for alternatives. The word he had passed on was that the Russians were far ahead of us, or were starting to get ahead of us in the biological weapons race, which was false and misleading. We were the world's leading experts in that field. I'll tell you why in a minute. But they then, and interestingly enough, the other fellow that Nixon was considering for that most important post in America, foreign policy and American intelligence, was Roy Ashe, the president of Litton Industries. So it's a good old boy network. You know, it's a small group of people. It's not a lot of people that we're talking about here. And so Kissinger ordered Laird immediately, almost immediately, to do a reassessment of America's biological weapons capabilities. And the reassessment came back, and he selected the option of developing these types of viruses. And, of course, then the money, of course, went to Litton Bionetics, which owned and virtually operated the entire National Cancer Institute's Fort Detrick, Maryland facilities. They held the contract to run it all. They administered all the money going through it. So I know the money went through there. And I know where the $2 million a year went. So how did Henry Kissinger get to that point? And how does it relate to America's biological weapons industry? Well, interestingly enough, I told you that it was the Merck Sharp and Dohm's hepatitis B vaccine that most plausibly brought AIDS to the world. American biological weapons industry's director was none other than George W. Merck, the president of Merck Sharp and Dohme for most of the Cold War. He was personally appointed by President Roosevelt to direct America's biological weapons industry. And at the end of World War II, there was a lot of very devious things ongoing. You had Allen Dulles. We have a wonderful airport in Washington, D.C., outskirts of Washington, named after Dulles, who, for the sake of Rockefeller and Standard Oil, negotiated partnership agreements with I.G. Farben in pre-Nazi Germany. That's the company, by the way, that used all of the concentration camp slave labor for all of their operations, and that they were the company that held the patent on the gas used in the gas chambers, partners with John D. Rockefeller and the Rockefeller folks. And they were doing some extremely devious things back then. They were creating the Cold War. They were going behind President Roosevelt's and President Truman's back. And they had a Central Intelligence Agency within the Central Intelligence Agency that very few people knew about. And that what happened was that they had an idea to get all of their colleagues out of Nazi Germany. All of the Nazis that you thought just disappeared or died, guess what? They didn't die. They all came under what was called Project Paperclip. In fact, Henry Kissinger, in 1948, was the chief Nazi hunter for American intelligence. And they started the United States Central Intelligence Agency as a cover organization for what was called the Gehlen Org. That was the German intelligence pre-Hitler, superseded the Nazi SS, funded by the Europe's and Germany's biggest industrialists. And that they desired to get all of their partners, all the Nazis, out, along with all the money, prior to Hitler's fall. And among the people that was brought over, there were 2,000 Nazis in total that were approximately 2,000 Nazis in total that escaped through the rat line. They went in a train, underground train from Germany to Rome, where the Vatican laundered half of the Nazi war chest, and the Chase Manhattan Bank, Paris branch, which stayed open during the entire Nazi occupation of France, laundered the other half of what was just left, $300 million. They had gotten all the rest out, all the rest of the booty out. already, the same train setup, and the Vatican supplied many of the false IDs that they were needed to get the Nazis out, and which ones they did not supply, Alan Dulles and his colleagues supplied, and they formed the Central Intelligence Agency to get them out, to act as a cover. Some of the people included the horrifying names of Joseph Mengele, the angel of death, the butcher of Lyon, Klaus Barbie, and Eric Traub, T-R-A-U-B, and his associate, Hitler's top biological weapons contractor developer, the world's leading virologist. They brought him over. He went to work for the Naval Biological Research Laboratories in association with the University of California, which is, by the way, where Dr. Peter Duesberg hails from. Many of you in the audience might remember the name Dr. Peter Duesberg. He's making the headlines. He's the one who's saying HIV does not cause AIDS. I'll inject myself with it, he says. You know, I found discussions between him and Dr. Robert Gallo. In fact, I published his contract, his special virus program contract in emerging viruses, AIDS, and Ebola. And you can see when Gallo asked him, hey, Peter, you think if we combine chicken leukemia, and he was a chicken leukemia sarcoma expert, you think if we did this, type C virus, you think we can get this to cause cancer in humans? Duesberg says, quote, that's absolutely right. Now he's saying all of a sudden he's had a change of heart. These things don't cause cancer. But, I do agree with him. 80% of what he puts out is true. It's the 20% that he's not telling you, I believe, is more important for you to know. What he did tell you is important, I think, for many of you who are suffering from HIV/AIDS, that AZT, DDI, 3TC, the protease inhibitors, all the drugs, the bad lifestyles, it's probably killing you faster than the viruses. Yep. So, but you know what? If there was a population control agenda, hey, knock off